Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Health Unlocked, the power of salutogenesis with Jason. Jason, how are you?
Not too bad. As I was just telling you, it's a little frustrating because there's lots and lots of pollen here. So my eyes are a little bit itchy. Ooh, and I almost knocked my computer over. I might rub my eye a few times here. I'll try not to.
Well, do what you have to. And the good news I have is that the podcast just crossed 50,000 downloads today. 50,000 downloads. That's incredible. And I was also looking at the ranking. So we are still in top 30 in US alternative health. We also got ranked in health and fitness category in top 200. So outside of US, we are also ranked in, 7 other countries: Egypt, Indonesia, Nigeria, Ukraine, Thailand, Canada, Hong Kong, Sweden. So definitely there's a lot of people who are interested in this topic, and especially salutogenesis in general. This is good sign. And I was telling you, somebody from Canada this morning followed on LinkedIn, which I saw specifically word salutogenesis mentioned there, which was really heartening to see. I was like, great, that's the exact audience. So keep listening. Keep supporting, and it is a big mission. So we want more and more people to spread the word and share it with your friends, share it with your families, and keep coming back to the show. And today is a very trending topic, I would say. It's a lot of talk going around metabolism and metabolic flexibility and how is that impacting everyone. So today we're going to talk about everything about metabolic flexibility. And so Jason, let's go dive in and start with how do you define it? Why do you think like this? Obviously, everyone has their own definition when it comes to metabolic flexibility. I've heard everything, to be honest, even to the point that people have mixed up fasting, fasting and keto and whatnot. I've heard everything. So I'm actually very confused too.
I mean, they're all components of it, but sure.
Yeah. So give us a definition here first, and then, talk to us a little bit. Why do you think people are misunderstanding it?
Okay. So let me actually start by saying that I didn't start out to really even care about metabolism, but as kind of we've discussed, I've watched people that I love kind of fall through the cracks, and they're told that they're fine until they're not, and they're told that they're healthy until they're not. And now everywhere I look, kind of see people who are kind of stuck in this, fatigue and inflammation and cycles of restriction and rebound and stuff. And metabolic flexibility is kind of really where the rubber hits the road in terms of mitochondrial function and a salutogenic lifestyle. And you're right that the phrase is everywhere right now, especially in kind of the alternative health and biohacking spaces. And you're right, it is often misunderstood and or oversimplified. So at its core, metabolic flexibility simply means the ability to use multiple fuel sources. But I actually want to step back from that because that kind of confuses things when you're talking about glycolysis or what's happening in oxidative phosphorylation. So let's define metabolic flexibility as mitochondria's ability to switch between different fuel sources. Primarily provate, which is when it's using glucose, and fatty acids, based on context, I guess, availability, and then the terrain state. So here's the key distinction is we're not talking about glycolysis. Remember, glycolysis is what happens in the cytosol outside the mitochondria, and then that's what is happening during that CDR1 and early CDR2 when mitochondria are kind of stuck in their M1 or early M0 states. And that's not flexibility. Really, that's more of a protective bypass. That just happens. Flexibility is the mitochondria's ability to go back and forth. When we talk about metabolic flexibility, it's again, we're talking about whether mitochondria can shift within oxphos, oxidative phosphorylation, between the two substrates. And that's really the functional hallmark of a coherent recovering terrain. Think of it like this, right? So your metabolism is like a hybrid car. It can run on gas or electricity, but only if the system can shift between them smoothly. Now imagine getting stuck in electric mode when you're climbing a mountain. I'm not trying to say that the electricity in this situation is bad. It's just limited and not right for the terrain. And that's what happens when your mitochondria loses its flexibility. It's not that the carbs are bad or fat is better, although a lot of people say that for specific, for reasons. It's more that the metabolic transmission kind of gets jammed, and that inability to shift is what underlies a lot of chronic dysfunction. Most people kind of miss that and treat metabolic flexibility more as a diet goal. Can I fast without crashing? Can I do keto without getting brain fog or whatever? And that turns it into a kind of a performance trick rather than a marker of like cellular intelligence and coherence. So again, what we really want to know is, can mitochondria switch fuels between or because of the system's resources, and whether it is when it becomes coherent and no longer reacting.
So what's the difference between metabolic flexibility and saying that just burning fat or doing keto? And why is this nuance so important, especially in chronic diseases?
So a lot of people do confuse metabolic flexibility simply with being fat adapted. And there are reasons for it because it's pretty similar. Or they assume that being able to do keto well automatically means that you're metabolically flexible. It does a lot, but there's, I don't know, it's a little more to that, right? So if your mitochondria can't switch back to oxidizing pyruvate, which, the glucose, like during when you've got acute stress or high intensity effort or redox transitions, then you're not truly flexible and you're just kind of stuck in a different gear. Now you're stuck in the fat burning gear. And that actually doesn't happen very often. And I don't want to say that mitochondria prefer one fuel over another universally. They respond to the terrain conditions. So fat is more efficient and yields more ATP per molecule. But glucose is oxidized faster, so it creates energy faster, and it requires less oxygen. That's when mitochondria uses glucose in those high demand states, like intense exercise. And then they shift to fat when oxygen is plentiful and then the terrain is more stable. I guess here's the catch. If someone's still in that early CDR, and they try to force fat oxidation through, keto or fasting or exogenous ketones, that's not flexibility, right? They're trying to bypass this. And the mitochondria aren't actually choosing what works the most here. They're kind of being backed into a corner. That can create more strain, especially in individuals who haven't completed the healing cycle, right? If you've got signals that are artificially pushing the cells through the cell danger response progression before they're ready, that's just it. Well, I don't know. That's just as bad as getting stuck, but that's also bad. And so I guess instead of celebrating someone for being, in a fat burning mode, the more meaningful question, I guess, is really, can their mitochondria shift based on the terrain cues? Can they return to that M mitochondria, that's the phenotype, and complete the healing cycle when it's proper? And so I guess, so again, metabolic flexibility isn't really about optimization now, right? So biohacking all ends up being this, we're trying to optimize this and optimize that. This isn't really about optimization. It's about adaptability. And that nuance kind of becomes everything in the context of chronic disease and recovery.
Yeah, very important point. A lot of people think about this in terms of optimization, which is like clearly put to the table here that it is a very different scenario we're talking about here. Really adaptability, and that is what is metabolic flexibility is all about. So can you walk us through how someone loses metabolic flexibility and what it looks like in real life when the body can no longer adapt to it?
Sure. So this is kind of where this becomes real for many people, right? Because the loss of metabolic flexibility doesn't really start with performance decline. It starts with that more terrain confusion. The body stops being able to shift those gears, and instead cells remain in that early phase CDR states for longer than they should. And this usually starts somewhat subtly. Repeated or unresolved stress, whatever, emotional, environmental, infectious, metabolic, whatever, disrupts mitochondrial function. The body then enters CDR1 more frequently or remains there for too long. we've talked about that a whole bunch. These are the chronic stressors that are occurring too often. And if the terrain lacks the kind of micronutrient resources like zinc and magnesium or B vitamins, the mitochondria can't return to that M2 or oxphos very well. And over time, the tissues kind of lose the capacity to switch between the fuel. So glycolysis dominates, not because it's efficient, but because it's the only pathway that's still available, right? Oxygen might be present, but mitochondria still aren't operating at their full oxidative state. And if local immune signaling gets skewed, it makes the terrain even harder to coordinate. So if we go back to, our hybrid analogy, let's pretend we've got a really smart car here. And glucose is the electricity. It's really easy to access. It's quick to deploy, and it gets you, through the city driving in that stop and go traffic really well. But when you hit the highway or go up hills, you really need to switch to gas. That's fat oxidation. So now imagine that your car is low on oil or something else that the engine actually needs to function, or, the fuel line's partially blocked, whatever. Your now super smart hybrid car can choose to stay in electric mode, not because it's ideal, but because the system can't really support the shift. And that's kind of what's happening here in this under-resourced terrain. The mitochondria don't have what they need to make the switch, so they kind of get stuck using glucose longer than they should. In real life, this doesn't show up as a dramatic failure. It shows up as post-meal blood sugar crashes or chronic fatigue and brain fog and anxiety that feels both wired and tired. That makes sense. And then poor sleep, low exercise tolerance, inflammation that won't resolve. Despite all of this stuff, despite having what you might consider a good diet and you're taking supplements, all that kind of stuff. So sometimes these people are, fasting or doing keto and even training regularly. They still kind of feel stuck. And that's a red flag. If your metabolism can't shift in and out in the different states, feeding to fasting, rest to activity, stress to recovery, then you've lost metabolic flexibility. And that kind of means that getting through the whole healing cycle, the whole CDR, is difficult. And again, the goal is not really to just pick a fuel and stick with it. The goal is to be able to restore the ability to switch back and forth, because it's that switching that allows the cell to progress through the healing cycle well. So I guess flexibility isn't the outcome. It's actually the enabler in this process.
And no mention of carbs in this discussion yet. So I'm wondering, something you would say about the carbs is that doesn't play part in this thing at all?
No, it does. And actually, I kind of purposefully didn't bring it up initially because that's a really common common assumption, I suppose. And it makes sense on the surface that carbs absolutely play a role in the root cause of metabolic inflexibility. They act more like fuel for an already kind of burning fire rather than the spark that is starting this. Here's what's going on. Okay, so glucose is the body's default fuel during the early phases of CDR, right? In glycolysis. That's in CDR1, the body detects a threat. Again, regardless of where that threat is coming from, it shifts into a state of, aerobic glycolysis. And that's our non-mitochondrial energy pathway. Remember, the mitochondria is not prioritizing energy production. It's doing other things. And so this is adaptive and temporary by design. Remember that's not a pathological thing. If people start calling this the Warburg effect, that's not a pathological thing. That's just what the mitochondria are supposed to do. Now, at the same time, if you overlay a carb-heavy diet on top of that, especially in a terrain that's already biased towards glycolysis, those tissues may stay in CDR or a CDR1-like pattern for longer. And it's not that glucose blocks mitochondrial recovery. It's that a steady supply of carbs can reduce best way to put this is it reduces the metabolic pressure to shift. So without a drop in glucose availability, mitochondria may have less reason to resume full oxphos, or I shouldn't put it that way. I should say return to a idealized M2 phenotype. So while carbs carbs don't necessarily, actually, let me back up and explain. We've talked about the 3 different phenotypes of mitochondria, the M1, the M0, and the M2. I can dig into that a little bit more. And in truth, it's actually better to think of this not as 3 separate things. It's really a range from the idealized M1, which is a fragmented mitochondria, and the idealized M2, which is a fused mitochondria that's elongated. Now, so to metabolize fat, you actually have to be closer to the M2 ideal. To metabolize glucose or even glutamine, it can actually be a little bit closer to the M1 ideal. In the middle, we basically made up somewhere in the middle, we're calling that M0. It kind of does both. And that's that's what's most prevalent in that CDR2, where it can operate in oxidose, but it generally doesn't. That all makes sense so far? Okay, good. All right. So now the deeper issue here is that the entire terrain becomes less responsive. Mitochondria, the redox networks, the immune signals, nutrient pathways, all of this stuff kind of start falling out of sync a little bit. And it's not just that one part of the system gets lazy, everything gets a little bit less dynamic. And while metabolic flexibility isn't always the root cause, it can become the kind of the primary driver of this dysfunction once it starts to falter. That's why it's such a powerful focal point, right? It's visible, it's measurable, and it influences every other part of this healing loop. So let's return to our metaphor real quick. Modern hybrids are designed to stay electric unless you push past a certain speed, right? At least that's what mine does. If you're always driving slower, similar to snacking on carbs all day, your body never has to kick in the gas engine. And over time, that engine, the mitochondrial fat burning machinery, can get a little rusty, whatever. The fuel lines can clog, timing slips, whatever. And eventually it's not that the system prefers electricity. It's just that it can't use the gas very well when it needs to. And that really is the mitochondria are not shifting all the way back to the ideal because they don't have to. Because if you're going to be burning glucose anyways, they only have to get most of the way back. Still enough to take you out of, CDR2, get into CDR3, maybe even resolve, but it's not as snappy. It's a little bit more sluggish. And essentially, that is the essence of metabolic inflexibility. It's not about burning the wrong fuel per se. It's about losing that ability to adapt. And if mitochondria aren't returning to that, to the M2 or close to the M2 ideal, it could be that you've got ongoing unresolved threat signals, relative deficiencies in redox cofactors like magnesium, zinc, keep hearing these same ions, chronic immune disorientation that keeps local tissues kind of in that early CDR phase. And, excuse me, here's the real kicker. You can cut out all the carbs and go full keto and still be metabolically inflexible. If your body can't tolerate glucose when it's introduced, and it feels like a crisis to you, that's not flexibility. That's also terrain fragility. And because glycolysis is the non-oxidase energy pathway, remember, it's far easier for the system to kind of slip into this carb dependence than fat dependence, right? Because we can use carbs regardless of whether mitochondria are functional or not. And then on top of that, even if they're less functional, they'll be able to use carbs and not fat. And that bias really isn't just about diet there. It's about how the body's wired to respond to stress, injury, and inflammation. So yes, a carb-heavy diet can bias the system towards using glucose, but the solution isn't, or saying, let's just eliminate carbs is too simplistic. We need to rebuild metabolic adaptability and restore the mitochondria's ability to respond to terrain change and needs, I guess, and a shift between the substrates in real time. And that's what real metabolic health looks like, not just the ability to metabolize fat. So that's a pretty good indication, to be fair.
So we talked a lot about carbs now, but what about the fats? Is there something like too much fat dependence, and then that could cause issue as well?
Yeah, it's a thing. It's significantly less common for sure, right? Just like carb dependence, over reliance on fat burning can reflect a kind of metabolic rigidity. And, so again, if you're in the healing model based on the CDR progression, early phases, the CDR1 and early CDR are intentionally glycolytic, and they shift to using glycolysis, they shift to glucose metabolism. And that isn't a flaw. It's part of how the body handles immune activation, redox signaling, and then the rapid energy demands without excessive oxidative stress. Although in CDR1, we are producing a lot of oxidative stress. But so in any case, if somebody is heavily fat adapted, whether through chronic keto, fasting, low carb living, whatever it is, the steady supply of fat or ketones may create a metabolic pressure to re-enter, or for the mitochondria to shift to the M2 state prematurely, even if the train is still calling for glycolysis. And that can cause a mismatch in the train. And I mean, in essence, you're forcing reintegration before the train's ready. And that can lead to incomplete clearance of, say, immune debris or microbial signals, skipped for I guess compressed healing phases. Compressed healing phases shorter, probably shorter than they should be, is better than saying skipped, because you're not really going to skip them. Poor tissue remodeling, or kind of this rebound inflammation. Ironically, if this mismatch persists too long, it can actually degrade flexibility itself. Mitochondria lose their responsiveness. They become locked into fat metabolism, unable to properly re-engage M2 when it actually matters. So while the pressure to shift toward M2 might occur early, over time, it can actually paradoxically result in inability to return to M2 very well, which I realize gets a little confusing. The lesson here is that no fuel source is ideal all the time. Even in health, the body needs to burn glucose periodically during, whatever, anabolic or anaerobic bursts, immune signals or immune surges, I suppose, with the signaling, nightly repair cycles, as we've talked about. Fat burning is efficient, but glucose oxidation is fast. Also oxygen sparing. It doesn't use as much oxygen. And it is redox modulating. It does, sometimes we do need some of these signals, and it creates a little bit more of those signals. So simply, yes, being too fat adapted can become a problem. It's pretty rare though, especially nowadays. And again, not because fat is bad, but because staying locked in one mode dulls the body's adaptive kind of intelligence. And I guess flexibility means that the mitochondria can shift gears when the terrain calls for it. And that's what keeps the healing cycle dynamic and able to complete well. Again, all that said, in modern lifestyles characterized by, the frequent eating, high stress, poor sleep, nutrient depletion, all of this, excessive carbohydrate dependence is far more common than excessive fat adaptation. That's why for many people, therapeutic strategies like ketogenic diets or fasting can be helpful interventions, almost universally. Again, they aren't the end goal, but they can act as a metabolic recalibration tools to help restore lost flexibility.
Yeah. And we were talking about this, that, there is a lot of talk, but not everyone gets it right? There's a presenting this in a wrong way, or sometimes even oversimplified way. So what are some of the oversimplifications that bother you the most? And what's the piece of metabolic advice you wish would just disappear because it's too oversimplified?
Okay. So yeah, and this is one of the kind of the reasons I would feel compelled to speak about this kind of stuff. Much of what we hear about metabolism from conventional sources, actually, I guess from conventional sources, it's mostly outdated or overly reductionist, biologically incoherent. Ironically, much of the alternative health space has replaced one set of oversimplifications with another. So remember, the conventional paradigm views glucose as the preferred energy source because mitochondria use it first. But that preference is actually a protective necessity. When glucose rises too high, it becomes toxic. So the body prioritizes burning it or storing it as fat to protect the system. Burning it is faster. Given that the alternative health space flips the script and says glucose is just bad and fat is good and keto is the answer to almost everything, it sounds actionable, but it really collapses a dynamic a dynamic phase-based healing system into a binary narrative. It disconnects metabolism from the terrain logic that governs when and why different fuels are used. So from a CDR perspective, glucose isn't bad. It's essential for sure. In CDR1 and early CDR2, glycolysis dominates by design, and it provides energy for the stressed infected cells without the need for mitochondrial involvement and freeing the mitochondria up for other actions. Again, that's not dysfunction, that's strategy. But I guess, remember, I was going to try and focus on mitochondrial metabolic flexibility. So let's jump back to that. And if we look at why mitochondria utilizes glucose rather than fats, it's because it can be oxidized in more fragmented transitional mitochondrial states, one that's still retaining some of the M1 or M0 characteristics. And that makes them more usable in inflamed or under-resourced terrain. But it also lets mitochondria get lazy. Remember? Excuse me, they never need to fully fuse and return back to that idealized M2 state. Over time, that then dulls the ability for them to transition and into a fully reintegrated M2 state. I guess oxidizing fat requires the more, obviously, more oxygen, so a more oxygenated and or well-resourced mitochondria and coordinated terrain signal. So when the cell's burning fat efficiently, it tells us that mitochondria are in a more idealized M2 state, almost by definition. So they're post-inflammatory, they're reintegrated, they're part of a coordinated whole. And in that way, oxidation isn't just cleaner, although it kind of is, but it can also be a kind of a metabolic exercise and a test, right? It reflects mitochondrial recovery and terrain coherence, but also forcing it to do that forces it to get all the way fully fused back to how it should be. But even that can kind of be overstated, I suppose. Just because a tissue is oxidizing fat doesn't mean the whole system's healthy. And just because another tissue is burning glucose doesn't mean that it's stuck. The body's kind of this mosaic. And in healthy terrain, different tissues can be in different CDR phases using different fuels, for different appropriate reasons. And that's why I kind of emphasize metabolic flexibility as this kind of more of as a signal instead of the goal or the cure for something, because it is the evidence that mitochondria are in M2 for sure, that the terrain is a little bit better coordinated, that system can shift when needed, and that adaptability is what's important, right? Another oversimplification that I hear all the time is that you must eat carbs after every workout or, something along those lines. And in most cases, if your terrain is stable and protein intake is sufficient, then the body can replenish the glycogen stores through amino acids and glycerol and lactate recycling and such. A high carb meal isn't necessary. That said, after high volume training or immune stress, a strategic carb refeed absolutely can help blunt cortisol and protect muscle and support reintegration and such. This is some of the reasons why when you get sick, you actually might crave some carbs, because that will help make sure that the body has enough fuel to get through the stages where it can't burn fat really well. So what'd you ask? If I had to pick one piece of metabolic advice that I wish would kind of just disappear, it's the just eat or just cut carbs. Not because that's always wrong, because in truth it's actually more right than it is wrong, but because it's too simple to be consistently useful. What matters isn't whether glucose is present, but whether the terrain can use it, clear it, and shift away from it when needed, right? And in a healthy system, some tissues will always be burning glucose, others fat, and that mosaic also isn't dysfunction. It's actually extreme elegance within the body.
Is there a way people can know exactly that this exact thing, like, should I just eliminate carbs or not? Because it's still burning. The glucose is still, the carbs are still getting processed, right, throughout, even in that duration. So is there an indicator people can use it and make a decision that, okay, I should cut down carbs now or still go with it?
Yes. And actually that whole lumen that we've talked about before, that's a really good way of doing that. I don't know that we have the time to really dig into exactly how you would do that, because on one hand, that just tells you what you're burning. You have to use a little bit of deductive reasoning based on what you're eating, what you're doing, what's happening, and what would be expected, or what you would expect to be burning. And then when those things don't line up, then you can start troubleshooting to figure out, okay, well, what am I doing wrong? Am I exercising too much? Or am I starting to come down with something? Am I getting sick? Did I not sleep enough? It can also be, am I eating too many carbs? Am I not eating enough fat? All of that can play into that. So it does take a little bit of thinking to understand how to really use that well.
Got it. And what about movement? How does movement matter so much for healing? And what does this mean in terms of mitochondrial behavior?
So, okay, this is actually kind of a critical point, because if we keep viewing exercise solely as kind of calorie burning or a calorie burning tool, that is really outdated logic. Movement and strength training actually reshape the terrain, and that the shift in kind of mitochondrial behavior there is actually more impactful than just burning calories. So modern life, I suppose, trains our mitochondria to stay fragmented. Fragmented more towards the MYD. So sedentary routines, low metabolic demand, carb heavy diets for sure, actually also coupled with the snacking throughout the day, chronic low level stress. All of this drives adaptation towards mitochondrial economy, not resilience, right? So again, when the mitochondria don't need to fuse completely to oxidize fat, when they don't need to do that, they won't. And that they're doing that on purpose, because if they never can, or if the terrain is not saying you need to oxidize fat, well, then they shouldn't spend the energy that it takes to get all the way there. They should stay where they're at. It's as these signals shift that we want that to then be able to shift. Though never get those signals, then it starts to kind of become sort of lazy, if you will. And exercise is one of the most potent signals that reverses this, right? It reintroduces demand for oxphos, forces redox adaptation, reactivates the cellular machinery for that mitochondrial fusion and elongation, and it trains it trains the system and the mitochondria to move towards that M2 ideal, toward the full integration, not just partial integration, reintegration. And resistance training in particular stimulates short-term glucose use during the activity, for sure. But the adaptation that follows is really where the magic happens there. This is kind of always the case, right? Mitochondrial density, redox efficiency, fat oxidation capacity between your training sessions. And the system becomes more flexible, more prepared to engage the M2 phenotype, and more capable of adequate CDR progression. Right. And that's really where it ties to chronic disease and such. But let's be clear, right? Exercise isn't the only path. Fat oxidation is demanded by other salutogenic inputs as well. And we talked a little bit about fasting, restorative sleep, for sure, low intensity aerobic movement, cold exposure, saunas, even extended periods of mental focus in fat adapted states. All of these help train mitochondria to fuse, elongate, and return more fully to that idealized phenotype. And that should serve as a reminder that health is an active, dynamic process. Remember early on in this, the kind of our podcast journey here, when I said health ultimately comes down to optimal mitochondrial function? This is really what I meant. These aren't hacks per se, they're signals that the body has evolved to expect. And without them, the signal defaults to energy conservation, and with them, it regains adaptability. That's why movement isn't just about, burning off the sugar, although, that's a good thing. It's also a biological signal that upregulates oxphos and reteaches the body to shift between the fuel sources. So you're not just burning energy, you're actually restoring the responsiveness. And that truly is the essence of a salutogenic life. Our ancestors didn't have to think about this. They moved and fasted and hunted and endured physical stress that all inherently reinforced mitochondrial resilience. That was just their life. Modern life by contrast, drives adaptations that actually favor mitochondrial fragmentation and metabolic stagnation. That's why today a salutogenic lifestyle must be consciously cultivated.
It gets me thinking that, we in modern times now, we kind of compensate for movement with exercise, right? A lot of time when you talk about people, hey, do body movement, they're like, oh, I'll do exercise, right? And that, I feel like that's not what you are saying here. You're saying is like, well, there is exercise, weight lift you should do, and then there's a part which is like movement of just like how you should do it, body movements, and that all together actually leads to this more of a all together it puts you in this right path to this mitochondrial flexibility, or at least towards the right direction, right? It's not just, you cannot skip things. That's
sure. Sure. Well, okay. So if you want to split that into movement and resistance exercise, actually, they're both really important. So resistance exercise is actually going to build muscle mass, and that is great for mitochondrial flexibility and mitochondrial function, mitochondrial density, all sorts of things. Movement itself helps. So actually this gets much more complex, right? Because then this brings into this all of the neurosomatic integration and the neuroimmune layers. And so the brain really needs movement, not just, I tried to lift something hard, okay, I'm done for the day. It needs movement. On top of that, our lymphatic system, which I think we talked about a little bit. Actually, I don't remember if we talked about it on the podcast or just personally. But the lymph system, so it takes movement to, actually pump this stuff through the lymph system. And I don't know that you're going to get enough of that just by lifting weights for a little bit. You might actually have to go around and do regular movement. But again, all of this you can kind of look back to, well, what did our ancestors do? Our ancestors were moving all the time. Every once in a while, they had to do they had to exert themselves significantly, probably a little bit every day. They would sprint a little bit every day. But most of the time, they were just walking around, or moving relatively slowly, trying to chase down prey, whatever. Did you ever read, was that book, Born to Run? It talks about how humans were born to run. And one theory is that so humans can actually run longer. Well, maybe not nowadays, but physiologically, we can run longer than just about any other animal. And now we can't go as fast as they can. And so the theory is that how we would hunt was we would just continue running in a group. And, like one person would run, and make an animal run this way, and then another would make it run that way, and just go back and forth. And eventually, the animal would just fall over from exhaustion, where humans could continue doing this for a really long time. And some of it has to do with how our respiration was not tied to our I want to say bipedal, but because we are bipedal, our respiration isn't tied to our movement, whereas most other animals are. In which case, if you make them run all the time, their respiration, they can't keep up, and it'd be like you're hyperventilating all the time. Well, yeah, that's good while you're sprinting, but at some point you got to stop. And if they're running, they can't stop. They have to keep breathing that same way. And so then they would just pass out, die, and, our hunting is done. So, and that absolutely probably occurred, or that sounded very funny. Likely what happened there is most of the time during that day that you were hunting whatever it was that you were chasing down, you were kind of jogging after it. And then, your friends were jogging over there, and, every once in a while you had to sprint really fast, but most of the time you were kind of slow. So yes, absolutely. We probably need to do both of these things.
Yeah. And so humans are chasers, animals are sprinters. That's kind of what it comes down to. How does metabolic flexibility relate to what, of course, you have called a salutogenic lifestyle, right? So can you connect the dots for us here?
Okay, so we've discussed that fat oxidation requires that fully fused, elongated mitochondrial networks, right? Something that's only achievable with a well-resourced, closer to the idealized M2 state, And actually, let me back up. I've said well-resourced a few times. What I mean by well-resourced is you've got sufficient zinc, copper, magnesium, and oxygen. That should all sound familiar. But also things like, coenzyme Q10 and lipoic acid and retinine. Well, that's hard for me to say. B vitamins. And actually, let me back up. I'll point out that zinc. So zinc isn't directly needed for mitochondrial support, but it's essential for immune signaling, especially in macrophage phenotypes M1 to M2. And again, I apologize. Remember, M1 with a macrophage means something different than M1 mitochondrial phenotype. So it gets really confusing. But so for the macrophage to shift from what is going to be signaling CDR1 to what is signaling entrance into the CDR to what is signaling progression, zinc is needed for that and for resolving this microimmune fatigue. So glucose and even glutamine, by contrast, can support oxphos in the more fragmented mitochondrial states. And that's why when the microimmune terrain is under stress or in the earlier stages of local nutrient deficiency, where the cells can still progress through the CDR, they just don't do it quite as well. That's where glucose and glutamine can actually still be used, right? So when flexibility is intact, then the cell can actually progress through the CDR well, switch between the fuels appropriately, and reintegrate more completely. When it's lost, the cell kind of adapts in place, and then that is when the chronicity sets in. And this really kind of becomes a terrain property. So a salutogenic lifestyle supports flexibility by restoring readiness. You're supplying the missing cofactors. You're rebalancing this local microimmune tone. You're cycling metabolic demand through fasting, appropriate fast use, appropriate fat use, and movement. And so again, the goal from a salutogenic lifestyle is not to micromanage metabolism. It's to remove the friction and let that healing cycle complete well. Because when you see metabolic rigidity, it's not necessarily the fuel of problem. It's a signaling failure. And flexibility is the first, metabolic flexibility is the first thing to go, or one of the first things to go in that when those signaling failures start occurring. And so to flip that around, metabolic flexibility also means that the train has adequate local access to redox cofactors like zinc and copper and magnesium, and then also the B vitamins and so on and so forth. And it has antioxidant capacity. Without all of this, even if the oxygen and fuel are available, the mitochondria can't sustain beta oxidation. That's fat oxidation. And then in that under-resourced terrain, mitochondria then naturally adapt, as I talked about. They remain a little bit more fragmented because there's no demand for it to elongate or fuse. And again, that's not dysfunction per se. That's a strategy. It can lead to dysfunction for sure. But the cells and the mitochondria are economizing by avoiding the kind of energetically expensive processes. That makes sense. But over time, just like a body adapting to a sedentary lifestyle by conserving energy for whatever, chair sitting and screen staring, these efficient, put them in little finger quotes, efficient adaptations undermine our long-term health. They degrade metabolic flexibility and reduce mitochondrial plasticity. And again, glucose and glutamine, by contrast, can support partial oxidative loss, and in even more fragmented states. That's why when the train's under stress, the cell defaults to using glucose or glutamine, and all of this is then ends up being kind of a shortcut that keeps it alive but prevents full reintegration.
And let's talk about cancer now, because there has been a lot of talk that you can actually starve the tumor by cutting off glucose and amino acids. Does that even work, if at all, or what does that strategy, or where does that strategy fall short?
So this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, because you're right. The idea of starving cancer, cutting off glucose or even other fuel inputs makes sense on the surface. And in some contexts, it might actually be useful. So I don't want to poo-poo it too much here. Excuse me. And there are different practitioners that are kind of exploring these angles with, fairly impressive technical precision and such. But still, their model assumes that the body is a battlefield and it treats cancer as something to deprive or destroy rather than something to resolve. And that shift in perspective really kind of changes everything, right? If the microimmune terrain is still compromised, if the local tissues are in a state of nutrient deficiency, redox imbalance, or are being suppressed by persistent fungal signals, then restricting fuel doesn't just starve the tumor, it starves the tissue that's actually trying to heal. Remember, cancer isn't simply tissue stuck in, cancer is simply our cells stuck in the proliferative stage, or CDR2, of the healing cycle, right? So it is technically true that cancer cells can't metabolize fat, or they can't burn fat. And we kind of talked about that, because in the CDR2 terrain where the M0 mitochondria dominate, remember, that's not really a thing. It's more in between the other two things. Fat oxidation is kind of structurally unavailable. The mitochondria are too fragmented and redox impaired to support the beta oxidation, but they can still oxidize glucose when it's available. Now, they don't too often in CDR2. They're focused on other things. But let's assume that restricting carbohydrate intake could meaningfully reduce glucose supply. And actually, before we make that assumption, let's back up. I question whether reducing glucose will reduce glucose intake, reducing carb intake, whether that's going to meaningfully reduce your available glucose or what's needed. Because if the body is demanding glucose, it can make it. It will make it through gluconeogenesis, which is, can convert proteins into glucose. And if you're eating enough protein and your body's demanding glucose, well, your body will just convert some of that protein into glucose. If you're not eating enough protein, well, then your body can get the glucose it needs from your muscle cells and other proteins, which you really don't want to have happen. So I don't actually think that's the issue. But let's assume that restricting carbohydrate could meaningfully reduce glucose supply. So how do you put that? So, okay, even if the systemic glucose levels remain stable, dysfunctional terrain may prevent local delivery to the tumor site, right? So, and that's what's really occurring here, I think. When the cells start no longer being able to get enough glucose, the body can produce it, produce it in the liver and such, but then you've got a systemic supply. And just like we've got a problem with local delivery, or systemic delivery to a local area that needs or has significantly increased demand for different redox ions, the zinc and the coppers and sulfates and such, and magnesium, eventually the same thing can happen with glucose. And so when that happens, our body, again, being fairly elegant, has another backup. Can't use fat, but it can switch and use glutamine. And so in that case, the cells shift to what's called glutaminolysis. That's hard to say too. Basically, that's a metabolic workaround, I guess. That occurs when the mitochondria are too fragmented to oxidize fat, and that's absolutely going to be the case in CDR2 and CDR1. Or it can also happen in CDR3, or even in a healthy state, when the mitochondria have become lazy and haven't fully returned to that fused M2 state. Or it can happen when mitochondria are under-resourced, missing some of those key cofactors, like the magnesium and such. So even if the oxygen was present and the cell was in an N2, it can't oxidize fats. Or last one would be the local glucose supply is now insufficient due to terrain collapse or distribution failure. Under those conditions, the cells tap into glutamine. So it's an amino acid. And that can fuel the cell, especially in CDR2, just enough to kind of keep it will go through just enough mitochondrial activity to keep it surviving, right? Because glycolysis can no longer happen. You don't have enough, or isn't happening enough to provide the energy. And remember, an M0 mitochondria can enter oxphos, just generally doesn't. Well, if the cell isn't getting any energy from glycolysis because there's no glucose, well, then it has to, and it will do it a little bit, and it'll use glutamine. And that's a big deal, because that's really kind of a triple threat when it comes to cancer, because that not only does it satisfy the cell's energy needs, it then amplifies the redox stress in an inflammatory tone. It also supplies the nitrogen, because it's an amino acid, so it has different nitrogens in it, for continued proliferation. And that's really not something you want to encourage. So, especially in tissue that's already struggling to reintegrate. I suppose that glutaminolysis doesn't occur until glucose demand outpaces supply. And, the body might be producing enough glucose systemically, but the local terrain, if it fails to deliver it where it's needed, then that terrain failure, it's not necessarily a metabolic adaptation failure there. Actually, before we go deeper here, what have we covered? Starvation might shrink tumors, but without terrain resolution, it's short-lived. And I get it. It can be tempting. You hear, oh, cancer feeds on sugar, and suddenly every grape looks like a grenade or something. And it's not about declaring war on fruit. We want to make this about restoring communication and making sure that the right messages and resources can reach the right places. Otherwise, you're not starving the cancer. You're actually starving kind of the neighborhood that's trying to rebuild. And, so to readdress glutamine, it's technically a non-essential amino acid because our bodies can make it. But it is true that under prolonged metabolic stress, glutamine becomes conditionally essential, meaning we can't produce it fast enough to keep up with a significant increased demand. So yes, restricting glutamine can help in late-stage cancers where terrain failure is pretty far advanced. But that's still a ketogenic approach, right? You're trying to force the tumor death through starvation, and that same restriction may suppress healing tissues as well, elsewhere. And even if you succeed, you push the tumor cells far enough so that they die, you still have a problem, right? Apoptosis is the preferred form of cell death, but that actually requires functional mitochondria with sufficient energy. You've just starved the system, so ATP is low. And now it's more likely that the outcome is going to be necrosis or necroptosis. Basically, that's just uncontrolled or inflammatory death of cells. And in the CDR2 terrain, senescence is also pretty common. And so, okay, great, you might have stopped proliferation, but now you've got a buildup of these stagnant tissues adding to the problem. Remember a couple episodes ago, we talked about that is aging. That is cellular aging. So what you've just done now is you haven't cleared the cells well. You've actually just accelerated aging in this area pretty significantly. And again, let's take this one step further. Suppose that the strategy works and the tumor shrinks. It may look like a success there, but if the tumor cells were harboring intrafungal or intracellular fungi, then those cells die by necrosis. The fungi are more likely to be able to then reinfect neighboring cells, right? So you just killed the host and you leave the fungi inside. Well, they're still kind of fine. And the other thing that might happen here is they might try to actively migrate to where glucose isn't restricted. That's kind of forcing metastasis. And that's kind of the real concern, right? You reduce the tumor size without resolving the cause. And like saying, you won the battle, but you set the stage to lose the war. Because fundamentally, it's about perspective again. If you view the cancer cells as misbehaving invaders, you want to kill them. If you view them as tissue stalled in a healing process, you ask, why can't they progress? Why have they stalled? And if we just resolved the reasons that the cells are trapped in CDR2 and restored the terrain for progression into CDR3, they wouldn't need to be killed. They'd self-terminate all on their own through apoptosis, just like nature intended. Or if they're actually still viable cells, well, then those ones wouldn't self-terminate. They could actually heal. And that's actually a better thing, right? We don't want viable cells to be forced to self-terminate because that's wasting the body's resources. And I've sort of lost count of how many times. Let me go back a little bit. People, kind of proudly tell me that, they're living a salutogenic lifestyle now. They're exercising and meditating and avoiding processed foods. And all this sounds great and wonderful until they mention that they've been vegan for years. And I kind of pause because, I know how hard it can be to hear the next part, but veganism isn't inherently immoral or dangerous. It's just incredibly difficult to sustain long-term mitochondrial health on a vegan diet, especially in the context of chronic illness. And yes, you can do it, but you have to be kind of hyper aware of these nutrient gaps that most vegans overlook. And the reason I'm kind of shifting gears a little bit here is I want to tell you about a friend of mine. Way too much pollen floating around here. So I met this guy at a Christmas party a couple of years ago when my son blurted out, "My dad's curing cancer. What's your name?" And kind of broke the ice. And Tom and I ended up talking for the rest of that party. I told him about eyeball and how it supports mitochondrial reintegration and redox tone and CDR progression and all this kind of stuff. And he was kind of fascinated and asked if I could help a close friend of his with incurable leukemia, someone that conventional medicine had given up on. And we've already talked about that guy. It's the same friend who, recently stunned his oncologist with blood work that returned to normal after using an eyeball product. Well, in any case, during that initial conversation, Tom shared with me that his own health journey and how he had cancer a number of years ago, and he changed his life and became active and started eating clean, and he beat his cancer. And he told me that he'd been vegan for years and it, never felt better. And I was like, okay, don't really know how to respond. How do you tell someone that the very lifestyle they credit for survival might also be silently kind of depleting them and such? And I guess to be clear here, I suspect that everything else that he did was enough to cure his cancer, despite his veganism, not because of it. And sadly, Tom recently had a heart attack, even though he thought he was in great shape, and his cancer has returned. And I don't share this to criticize his choices. I share it because I care. And I've seen this pattern too many times, right? So from a metabolic flexibility standpoint here, the mitochondria kind of looks stable on the surface here until stress really hits. And then the terrain collapses. And you can't kind of fake your way into this metabolic resistance. You have to feed the system what it truly needs. And that really means respecting biology more than ideology.
Yeah, that's a very key point. A lot of time we start with ideology first, and that's a problem. Sometimes it's
Yes.
and I don't know how to say it nicely, but it's kind of like very irrational in that way. It's like just doesn't make sense. If someone is dealing with chronic illness or just suspects they are not metabolically flexible, what's the small first steps you would have them take to start regaining that flexibility? Is it even possible to regain flexibility? Let's talk about that.
Sure, of course. Right. So, I'd focus on trying to live a more salutogenic lifestyle to restore metabolic flexibility. That's really the best path to train the mitochondria to be able to regain that fully idealized M2 structure. And that'll help ensure that your mitochondria can make clean, coordinated shifts from fragmented M1 through M0 all the way to the fused M2 states. And remember, that's not, so let's back up a sec, right? So we talk about CDR1, CDR2, CDR3. They're not really separate things either. It's all one process. It's just early in the process, this is what's happening. In the middle of the process, this is what's happening. And the end of the process, this is what's happening. But so there's not like any thing that you cross. We've kind of defined these, or I guess Dr. Naviaux has defined these things as to, and they're really kind of come down to what the mitochondria are capable of. And so where you are in the cell danger response really is directly tied to how fused or how fragmented the mitochondria are. And so really, it's not different things. It's the same thing.
It's the same sequential process. We just don't know where is it in that process. That's what.
Yeah, and it's a lot easier for us to talk about these as three separate states because really the cells are trying to do very different things at those different stages. But it would be difficult, like if you could be within that stage and you're walking along, there wouldn't be like you hit a wall, open a door. Oh, look, I'm in the next phase. It's you're walking along a little and then you look around. Oh, hey, I'm in the next phase. That's more what that ends up looking like.
Right.
Now, from the standpoint of how to regain this, so I guess early on, this does likely mean focusing on utilizing fat as an energy source. And absolutely, I would get a Lumen device to help guide that process. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer your question. What are the small steps? So I would start fasting intermittently, and I would just start extending, the overnight fast, and then use that Lumen device, test myself every hour. And then once I see carb utilization kick in, I know it's time to refeed. I would eliminate carb heavy snacks. As we discussed, that removes the need or the strong signal to kind of shift all the way back to the fused M2 mitochondria. I would start walking after meals. That's not about burning calories per se. It's about signaling the terrain is more stable and fuel switching is required. I would decrease carb intake. And again, so when it's time to refeed, I would actually try a meal of protein and healthy fats and then retest in a couple hours and see if I shifted back to more fat burn. If so, that's good. If I'm not, well, then it might mean that my body still demands more glucose, in which case I would want to feed it glucose so that it doesn't, well, not necessarily. You could just increase protein, know that your body's going to be burning some of that protein off as energy instead of using it as building blocks, but that's okay. I'd eliminate seed oils and refined sugars for sure. Those kind of drive redox imbalance and derail terrain signaling. Seed oils are highly oxidizable and create they can create that background inflammation that reinforces the M1, M0 mitochondrial states. And refined sugars just promote glucose spikes that override normal mitochondrial flexibility. If I'm not a vegan, I would add in ruminant organ meats. So ruminants, I find this interesting. Ruminants have a very specialized digestive system, right? And they can extract almost all of the nutrition from plants. Interestingly, you might have heard that, grass-fed beef is better than grain-fed beef. And that's not as strictly true as most people believe. The nutritional value between the two, or I guess I'll say the nutritional value of the grass-fed beef is better, but only slightly better. It's not really that significant. And again, that's largely due to the cow's amazing digestive system. But far more important is that grass-fed cattle are almost never given hormones. And that's a much bigger deal. But if you're asking about someone dealing with chronic disease, then I guess, and you can afford the grass-fed beef, then I would go and take every advantage I could, for sure. If you are a vegan, then work with a really good nutritionist who understands that vegetables are trying to kill you. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but really it's hard to be a vegan and not be somewhat malnourished. Now remember, you can do anything for a short period of time. And that short period of time might even be, a couple of years, but eventually that's probably going to catch up with you. And if nothing else, then they're probably focusing on, the fats that they're having are probably lots of seed oils again. They're probably not going to be having, they won't be having tallow or ghee or butter, which are far better fats for you. But, I suppose they could be having avocado and stuff. Those are good fats. And coconut oils and such. Those are good fats. But so the focus would be on bioavailable sources of B vitamins and zinc and essential fatty acids. You might also want to consider some kind of functional testing and stuff to confirm that you're not running deficits that will impair mitochondrial regeneration reintegration. I would get early morning sun. That's it's not just about vitamin D, but vitamin D is great. It's actually, that's a circadian anchor. So early light kind of resets the super chiasmatic. That's another hard one to say. Nucleus sets mitochondrial clocks and helps kind of regulate glucose metabolism through this central signal. Try and sleep well in a cool dark room and such. Try and get more omega-3 fatty acids, which support membrane flexibility and reduce the pro-inflammatory lipid signaling. They also make it easier for mitochondria to transition out of M1 and improve terrain coherence and everything. You probably want to train with intention or move. And remember, engaging in even just a couple resistance training sessions a week can have a greater impact on mitochondrial resilience than almost any supplement stack. And gaining more muscle mass not only expands glucose storage capacity, it improves kind of the whole body insulin sensitivity, which are two pretty critical factors in restoring metabolic flexibility. And remember, we've talked about it before, both Katsu and isometrics can actually accelerate those adaptations. And I suppose if I was dealing with chronic disease, I'd also move beyond just the things that promote a salutogenic lifestyle. I'd start incorporating some things that directly support mitochondrial function. All of those MOCO protocols, the multifaceted optimal cellular oxygenation protocols that we talked about. Adaptive contrast exercise with oxygen therapy, so that conditions the body to both accept hypoxia, but it also increases cellular oxygenation a lot, at the same time giving these signals to be able to take up the oxygen. Hyperbaric oxygen that's an excellent alternative if movement is limited or contraindicated and you can't actually exercise. That makes the exercise with oxygen therapy kind of hard to do if you can't exercise. I would start doing pulsed electromagnetic field therapy to help restore and or correct some of the cellular charges. I would do sauna and cold exposure. Those hormetic tools are kind of help reset the terrain signaling and or redox tone. And of course, I would use some forms of eyeball product because if you're actually dealing with chronic disease, it's highly likely that you've passed just the simple metabolic flexibility stage and you're really into the territory of local nutrient deficiency. But again, I don't want to think of all of these things as hacks, and I've sort of stopped thinking of all of this as biohacking life. These are signals, and we need to be giving our body the correct signals. These are signals that, our ancestors got just by living life. And so really kind of when it all comes down to it with all this stuff, give your mitochondria the chance to kind of relearn this metabolic flexibility, everything gets easier. And at the end of the day, you're not trying to run on gas or run on electric. You're trying to drive a car that knows when to switch. And that's what metabolic health and metabolic flexibility really is.
Fantastic. This brings down to the closure of today's episode. Pretty detailed, and we kind of gave the blueprint here to not just the basics of metabolic flexibility, but to the point of, I like to say, living a salutogenic lifestyle. That's what we ended it. And that is the core to our show. So as you can see, so everything plays and connected with, even with metabolic flexibility in that way. And this has been great. A very insightful conversation, and hope our listeners, wherever you get this information, you find it useful. And if you have any questions, of course, reach out to us via our website or wherever you get this podcast from. And we can then obviously take your questions, inquiries, whatever you have. Thank you, Jasen. Much appreciated once again.